Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the War of Rebellion podcast for Age Soul War. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and I'm coming from beautiful northern Germany on the day before Labor Day, May 1st today, so I can actually be up a little later for a rather exciting interview today. And with me is from the land of Lincoln, of all things. J. Matthew Ward. Matthew is a assistant professor at Quincy University in Illinois, just off the banks of the Mississippi River. As a proud graduate of the University of Arkansas, I do hold against him that he has a PhD from the weird Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. Always enjoy that meetups that we have in various sports every year.
That's okay. I'm not much of a sports guy, so I
Neither
leave the
am I.
sports partisanship to more adept people than I am.
Indeed, I totally agree there, but I know some of the people that listen to it are sports fans.
That's
But we're
okay.
going to talk about a Louisiana topic of all things too,
Yes.
and his recent book, I should say, because it was LSU Press. I'm always a little behind, unfortunately, catching up with everything. And I do have a print copy for once with me here. Garden of
Excellent.
Ruins, occupied Louisiana in the Civil War. Very nice book cover as well, like a nice
Thank you. Yes, I'm
hardback.
very pleased with it. Green is my favorite color, and I didn't
Yeah,
even tell them that, and they made the cover all green, and I was very pleased.
awesome, awesome, nice. So, I mean, I guess it's a very quick one because I always like to ask my authors to tell me how this book comes about. But you have a degree from Louisiana State. You're talking about Louisiana, so it seems like you just went to the archives in the state for your dissertation research.
Sure. I can add a little bit more detail. As a humanities professor, I could always talk at length about anything, as you're no doubt familiar. I grew up in rural Mississippi, and so I
Ooh.
was surrounded by Civil War history there, and that's where I first learned to love Civil War history. But as many young men are, I was interested in the battles and the
Hmm.
leaders and all the strategy and things. And then when I was an undergrad, I was looking for a research topic for my senior thesis. And I happened to be touring the Interpretive Center at Corinth, Mississippi, and
Ooh.
they had some quotes from some of the Confederate nurses that were there. And suddenly, as a 18, or I'd say I would have been more like 22 at that time, as a young man, it suddenly occurred to me that there was much more going on in warfare than just the battles and the front lines activity. So that's what first got me interested in civil military relations.
Hmm.
My master's degree I got at the University of Missouri working with Dr. Leanne White,
Hmm.
who introduced me to this concept of household war and understanding the Civil War as a relationship between household relations and production on the ground level with the military strategy that's going on both on the battlefield but behind the lines as well. And so when I came to LSU, I knew I wanted to keep writing about Confederate women
Hmm.
and occupation, which had largely been the subject of my master's thesis. And you're right. I walked into the archives at LSU and started reading all sorts of things and quickly realized that I could expand the topic much larger
Hmm.
than just women and occupation. But so that's chapter 4 in my book, but I extended it out to other things as well. So it's kind of been a lifelong passion of mine, military history. But when I got into graduate school, I added social history
Hmm.
with that. And this is the ultimate product of the
Hmm.
merger of those two interpretive frameworks.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up the Corins Interpretive Center for the National Park Service because it's such a beautiful place to go.
Yeah.
If anyone hasn't listening here hasn't been, it's a great place to go because and it's so unique because it's not about the battles, right? It's like you got Shiloh about what 40-minute drive north of there, and
Yeah.
it's a battlefield. And most of the National Park Service sites are battlefields. But this is
Yeah.
not. It is a battlefield, Zed. is in Corinth, but it's remembering sort of the also the contraband camps, the kind of what do enslaved people do as the war comes to their doorsteps, and it's really kind of the personal side.
Yeah. And Corinth is a great example of a home front that becomes a battlefront as
Hmm.
armies are pushing back and forth through the streets. And military occupation is a great subject to study
Hmm.
both the actual shooting guns fighting of the war, but also the much more policy centered relational sense of the
Hmm.
war, which I'm deeply interested in.
Yeah, no, it's no, that's no, that could be a whole nother conversation right there.
Yeah.
Um, but so you're looking in your book at sort of the household and how occupation manifests in different forms. And one of the things I want to start with is sort of the source material, right? Like
Yeah.
when you went into the LSU archives, into the state archives, and read various letters and reports, I don't think any of those were reports no one else had seen before. That
Yeah.
you, how did you approach them to kind of read them in a different fashion?
They may not be new to other people, but they were new to me. Up
Mm,
until that point, I had focused mostly on formal military reports like the
mm,
OR or a lot of published
mm,
diaries and letters and things like that. And certainly I had been to archives before, but in mounting enough material to write a dissertation, you kind of just grab everything you possibly can. So the Hill Memorial Library at LSU is great because it has diaries, both the original copies and the transcripts. It has all sorts of business records. So I was able to look at those and kind of see what things the Confederate
mm,
government had on hand during the war. Um, Lots of personal letters and plantation records as well. But I would say the largest portion of the collection that I looked at comes from the National Archives. So
mm,
I took two trips to DC when I was working on my dissertation that eventually became this book. And I was looking at record group 393, which is where all the military records are
mm,
housed, and in particular, the Department of the Gulf. So I pulled all of the provost marshal records, letters sent, and a few of the
mm,
letters received. And I had no idea what I was getting into because I'm sitting there at the table, and then I hear this squeaking in the distance, and around the corner comes this very squeaky cart, and it has maybe 15 huge boxes on it, and each one of those boxes had thousands of documents in there. I've seen a handful of them cited in other books, but if there's any kind of source material that people haven't greatly utilized in other works of history, that would be it. Just because it's so insurmountable. You know, I took
mm,
maybe 1,000, 2,000 pictures of sources and then transcribed them because I like to have a keyword searchable
mhm,
document. And so I have just hundreds of pages of transcribed documents at this point. And then it was a matter of taking everything that I had read and looking for major themes. How many
mm,
times do deserters show up? How many times does weapons confiscation show
mhm,
up? Runaways, loyalty oaths. And once I organized all of those topics, I had to decide how am I going to write? How am I going to fit them into chapters? So I
mhm,
organized them again. And so it was as much a work of organization as it was of reading. And then for the sources that other people have used in other books, I approach them by trying to look at the social experience
mm,
of the people who wrote them. So there is the Stewart diary housed at UNC, which shows up in Hard Hand of War by Mark Grimsley. It shows up very
mm,
frequently in Civil War texts, but no one had ever talked about his relationship to women in that
mhm,
text. So there's this great scene where he's passing through a town and he sees a woman with a squirrel crawling on her and crawling through her dress, and he writes about it in this very sexually titillating way or whatever. So I was looking for moments in the sources that people had not used before in terms of civil military relations. Because often the sources that I looked at were used from a purely military standpoint. And there's nothing wrong with that. I just wanted to take it a bit further.
Yeah, that's sort of from the historiographical perspective, right? It's sort of like you usually look at it from sort of either the kind of African American side with the contraband camps, like Amy Taylor's work on that, or you have Grimsley and the like with sort of the hard hand of war or whatever we want to kind of call the occupational aspect of the American Civil War. So it's sort of refreshing in that. And you also like made sure to kind of talk about both sides. That this is sort of like it's a bit cliche saying it, but it's the frontiers that we're talking about in Louisiana, where the Union, U.S., Confederate kind of meet, engage, but they're also kind of there's this no man's land in there.
Yeah. I had started off writing this project simply about Union
Mhm.
occupation, but as I was studying the primary sources from the Confederate perspective, trying to get their experience of Union occupation, I quickly realized that many of the things that the Confederates were doing were very similar to what the Union Army was doing, confiscating property of Unionists or chasing away people that don't support their political ideology. They are raising taxes.
Hmm.
They are conscripting men. They're doing all these sort of big state things that they would have traditionally accused or labeled as tyranny of the North. And so then I decided that the concept of occupation uh, as a relationship between military forces and civil forces is in some ways a question of democracy. You know, how does a democracy at war fight with itself? And if democracy is about not only political participation but also social participation, how does the military affect that? And because I saw the Union military and the Confederate military limiting public participation or regulating it in the same way, I decided I had to expand the project to both the Confederate and Union side, and kind of question or not question, but I interpret democracy very fluidly in the
Hmm.
book. Um, if we interpret democracy from a purely political standpoint, such as the direct political mechanisms of
Hmm.
democracy, voting, running for office,
Hmm.
going to a rally, that's a very white male space in the
Hmm.
19th century. But if we consider democracy is also about social inclusion, what stores can you go to? What jobs can you hold? What kind of life are you allowed to have in a free society? Um, which to me is very much an important component of
Hmm.
democracy. People don't tend to concentrate on that, but when I'm lecturing here at the university and I get to the civil rights era, for instance, I
Hmm.
say it's all well and good that civil rights activists pushed for the vote, but then they also worried about the material realities they had to deal with. Do you have a car to get to the voting booth? Do you know how to read? Do you know how to register? These sorts of things are part and process of making a democracy function. And what I discovered with the Confederate and Union military occupation is there's some parts of a democracy that struggle to work.
Hmm.
It's hard to get elections going and count the votes and then deal with the political fallout of whoever's elected. But there are other parts like distributing clothing and food that flourish very well, and we can see some of the precursors of like a welfare state kind of
Hmm.
going on with military occupation. So that's my project quickly ballooned from just what's the experience of occupied women under Union military occupation to what does occupation say about the nature of America? And the Civil War is this moment of opportunity where we
Hmm.
could have had a more welcoming and inclusive biracial nation. And as I and other scholars have written, the Union just kind of was not going to, they didn't have that much gas in the tank, so to speak. They were not going to push that hard into Reconstruction.
Yeah, sort of there wasn't a kind of envisioning of what could be. You know,
Yeah.
um, I I take a much more narrow definition of democracy usually in my work, considering I've done sort of
Sure.
global democracy, but that's interpretation that where we disagree. But as you were talking, I was thinking, I think it was Ben Severance who did a book on Alabama, and he talked about sort of how in Alabama in the course of the war, there was then sort of laws put in place of like that Confederate soldiers who were on the front lines couldn't vote because they weren't in the state anymore. Louisiana must be even worse because they're cut off eventually after 63 was Port Hudson and Vicksburg. So how much is Louisiana limiting Confederate soldiers' ability to participate in the
That's an
political
excellent
process?
question. I don't know off the top of my head how many soldiers would have been voting. I don't even know the vote totals of the 63 election for because Moore is replaced with a new governor halfway through the war. And I don't even know if I know the vote totals off my head, but they're pretty sparse. I mean, even
Mm,
votes for secession are
yeah.
pretty sparse. Um,
Which is interesting because we're always like Southerners like to present like it's such a popular saying, but then when you look at the numbers, you're kind of like, is it really?
Yeah, I'm of the persuasion that, as I write about extensively in the first chapter, secession is kind of a two-legged animal, right? It's not just the elites that are pushing it through at the top. You have to have a certain number of people supporting it from the bottom, and
Mm-hmm.
then in that process, you see how many people were indeed opposed to
Mm-hmm.
secession. Um, and that also gets at this concept of democracy. If you're denying
Mm-hmm.
people from uh, either voting or being able to freely maintain their property once they live in a regime that they don't support, how free or democratic is that society? Um, so, yeah.
Yeah, Louisiana always has some issues there.
They're not the only ones, but
No,
it's a
no.
particularly good place to look at because the battles are relatively limited and small.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that they're unimportant, but there's a lot of political work that's being
Mm-hmm.
done there. Like Lincoln's trying to get Louisiana in as one of the reconstructed states very early on, so he can use that as an example of his Reconstruction policy.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of political work being done. And of course, that political work entails, well, do black people get to vote? Do black men get to vote in the election? Unfortunately, they didn't in '64, but they do for some time after that. And then, of course, when Southerners resumed control across the South, they shut out black people from the process of voting again.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And I kind of also was thinking of like the 1870 72, 76 elections, right? That I'm blanking on his name right now. Um, civil rights historian who just wrote a book about that. Um, and it's really interesting to kind of sink in like this Adam Fairclough. There it is, Adam
Yeah, yeah,
Fairclough. Like how Louisiana like at the start of secession, like during Reconstruction, has these problems with just getting these votes done
yeah,
properly. But what I even more thinking in terms of like what you just talked about is also sort of like because there's different ways how we can get people to kind of be supportive, right? There's sort of the welfare state, like I can make you dependent on me as a state and thus get your support. I can coerce you. I can use military force and use patrols, militia as a threat of the draft and kind of force you. But then there's also the ideological side that like creating that Confederate nationalism and kind of having people buy into that. So I'm kind of curious how do you see the interplay from the Confederate side when we'll then switch soon to the Union side, but from the
yeah,
Confederate side of like how much do people buy into it from an ideological perspective, but then also how many people are just plain out scared of the
yeah.
military force that the Confederacy or the state of Louisiana brings to bear.
Yeah, when I was researching this, I really wanted to find some numbers or at least come up with some concrete
Mm,
numbers of like we this many people in Louisiana approximately that are supporting secession and this many opposed to it. Just with the nature of the source material in the 19th century,
mm,
it's pretty hard to come up with those kinds of numbers. What I determined is that there's a pretty strong street level element of Southerners in Louisiana who support secession,
mm,
and they join together in vigilance committees and committees of public safety, and they go around, patrolling the streets, making sure there are no slave rebellions,
mhm,
making sure that there's no abolitionists or unionists speaking out. Not that there would have been that much to begin with. And there's also coercing people into the ranks. And
mhm,
that includes, to some extent, at least in New Orleans, free black men, forcing them into the
mhm,
Creole units, which I think is more just a way of keeping an eye on them
mhm,
rather than actually arming them for the Confederate cause. So that's one way of looking at Confederate support
mhm,
is just the coercion that occurs on the ground level. Secondly, you can look at the outpouring of material of items that
mhm,
Southerners create, blankets, food, ammunition that they're sending off to local defenses and to Virginia, of course, as Confederate soldiers leave there. So these two elements really indicate to me that at least at the beginning of the war, there's an immense amount of support for
mhm,
secession. On the other hand, there is strong evidence that there is an enclave of unionism that's not negligible in
right,
Louisiana. Um, there's various instances of sabotage
mhm,
that occur in the construction of Confederate ships or supply depots. Most notably, as Michael Pearson has written about, there's this big mutiny at Fort Jackson and
mm,
St. Philip right before the Union forces arrive. There's several hundred Confederate volunteers that say, we don't want to be here, we don't like how we're treated, and they all leave. That to me doesn't necessarily signal union support. This is
mhm,
where things get kind of tricky. Just because
right,
someone doesn't want to be in the Confederate Army doesn't mean they support the Union.
mhm,
And just because someone is relying on Union supplies or protection from the Union military means that they're not, at least in some way, supportive of the Confederate community. So. I wish I could put a percentage on it, like 75% of Louisiana pro secession, but I get the sense that it's probably like three-fourths, one-fourth,
mm,
if I'm going to speak with some very vague
yeah,
concept or numbers. That there's a strong enough contingent of unionism in the state that shows up or
mhm,
comes out of hiding when the Union military arrives.
yeah,
And so we can't ignore that, but we also can't ignore the extensive amount of coercion that
mhm,
the Confederates are enacting. And if they have that much power, that means that there are a lot of people to fill the Confederate ranks.
mhm, right. Well, but one thing that kind of strikes out, and this is sort of like for later parts of your book, is when the Union forces eventually arrive and sort of try to get people to kind of show their allegiance and they're asking for loyalty oaths. How much can we trust when people take these loyalty oaths? Are
Sure.
you just doing it because it's convenient, it gets you benefits, but at heart you're not? Like, I mean,
Yeah, I think your guess is as good as mine
eh,
on that one about how much we can trust a loyalty oath. I have several quotes from General Bowen and others in the Union Army that say, be careful with these
mm,
loyalty oaths. And just because they take them, don't trust them. On the other hand, General Bowen also says, one who doesn't take the oath should be to you as one dead.
mm,
I remember when I came across that in the National Archives, I was very excited because those are the kind of quotes that
mhm,
pop out of the record that you really want for your
mhm,
books. I would say first and foremost, the loyalty oaths are important for record keeping. The
mm,
Union Army just wants to know who they've got on their hands and how many people are behind their lines. And so, as the various quotes I just referenced can demonstrate, they're well aware that they
mhm,
can't trust everyone who takes the oath, but at least they have these enrollments, as they call them,
mm,
so they can know. who's behind our lines. And if someone gets arrested, they can take a look at those roles and question their allegiance, question whether they need to be banished out of the line. So I think first and foremost, it's a bureaucratic tactic and probably a pretty wise one at
Hmm.
that. On the other hand, there are instances of people coming into the lines saying, we walked here, we rode here to get away from the Confederates. We absolutely want to take the oath because they realize that taking the oath means protection of property. Technically speaking, as long as you agreed to adhere by the edicts of the Union Army and not cause any trouble, Butler and others say, we're going to protect your property. You don't have to worry about us coming in like the French Revolution and just causing chaos and burning everything and grabbing up everything. It's not an army of defamation and
Hmm.
conquest. An army to restore the republic. And if you take that oath, you can take your place in the restored republic. So I think it's also a strategy of protection in that way that many people do take seriously. And lastly, as we were just discussing, it is just a practical maneuver for some people. They realize I'm stuck behind enemy lines. I'm going to be classified as an enemy of the
Hmm.
state if I don't sign this, or they're going to take my grandmother's piano. They're going to take my land. They're going to take my horse if I don't sign this. I don't care about the Union, but I'm going to sign it anyway. And the Confederates are very aware of this.
Hmm.
Governor Moore, Benjamin Palmer, a Presbyterian minister from Louisiana, specifically write either public edicts or pamphlets that say, stop doing this. You cannot be a loyal Confederate and take a practical oath just to slide by and hope that you can weather the storm. And that's not what a good Confederate does. I don't think that they're being very practical minded about the situation on the ground for people.
Hmm.
But yeah, those are the three aspects that I see loyalty as being used in.
Yeah, and I mean, as you where you probably will look at more as you get into the sort of neutral zone between the two sides, it gets even more difficult. But I did like your word choice there because you very clearly say that this army of occupation is here to safeguard the republic
Yeah.
and restore the republic, which of course, and as you show at numerous occasions throughout the book, this is not an army there for a social revolution to change society in a
Yeah.
dramatic fashion. But it's like, wow, you're like, yeah, we're not changing things. We're even though it's an army that comes with a free labor ideology.
So this idea of what the American Republic would look like has been debated to death within historiography. People like Eric Foner and others have talked about the extent to which the Civil War is or is not a social revolution. I think that people like Foner have very successfully argued that even though the war starts off pretty conservative at the beginning, that by the end of the war, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, especially, the war has taken on some pretty radical implications. I wanted to see how that worked out on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many Union soldiers who show up and they're only determined to defeat the slave power, defeat the Confederacy, and that's it. They're not there to create some sort of biracial republic or any sort of social revolution. But I think some of them changed their minds. The most important non-Louisiana example I can think of that is Wilbur Fisk, the Vermont soldier
Mm-hmm.
who I always assign his letters to my Civil War class because he's writing in 1862 about how much he dislikes black people. And by 1864, he says slavery is absolutely the root cause of this war. Anybody that doesn't agree, they have a problem. In Louisiana, um, I think we can see instances of that. Butler shows up and he immediately starts passing policies about social order and who's going to pay taxes and how women should act. He doesn't really. I mean, some enslaved people he starts sending back to the plantation. He's
Mm-hmm.
only
Right.
concentrated on maintaining the social order, not on some sort of social revolution. But by the time he leaves that winter, he has started recruiting black
Hmm.
men into the army. So I think from May to December of 1862, we get like this speed course, so to speak, in the speed run in the person of Butler, in which he has really shifted his views. Now, how
Right.
much we want to call that a social revolution, I don't know. I
Mm.
tend to interpret the Civil War pretty conservatively.
Mm.
Its biggest radical accomplishment was ending slavery, and that's about it. It didn't
Mhm.
widely redistribute property or, uh, um, you know, uh, disenfranchise Confederates and throw them in prison. It wasn't quite that radical. So I think there's something of a moderate or very conservative social revolution that emerges from the Civil War.
No, I totally agree with you on that assessment like that. Especially when you think of it in comparative perspective, it's compared to what's like happens, for example, in Mexico, right? Like we're not
Yeah.
putting Jefferson Davis against the wall on shootout like they did with
Yeah.
Maximilian. So, uh,
Yeah. I won't say that we should have done it, but I wouldn't say we should have not done that either.
yeah, you know,
Uh,
could
but
have solved a lot of neo-Confederate problems we have today.
yes, yes. That's one of the fundamental problems of Reconstruction, which is why I call the conclusion of my book "Democracy Delayed," is that the
Hmm.
if the Union Army in general had adopted Butler's like very aggressive attitude towards
Hmm.
Confederates across the entire South and maintained that during
Hmm.
Reconstruction, I think we would have a much different nation in
Right.
America today. But it didn't happen, and I think we're still dealing with the long-term consequences of that.
No, yeah, exactly. But since we're on Butler, let's stick with Benjamin
Yeah,
Butler, and as Southerners sometimes like to call him the Beast, which of
yeah,
course is a title he gained in New Orleans. But I really enjoyed how your book is very narrative heavy, but you have these moments there, like Butler at the start of his section, where you actually dabble briefly in it in the historiography to kind of be like, this is where I found, this is why we need to rethink Butler. So
yeah.
what was your biggest quarrel with previous historians that you kind of were like, no, no, you we need to think differently about Butler.
Well, to be honest, I came to this project being not a big fan of Butler myself. And then by the time I
Okay.
finished it, I had kind of come around to his way of thinking. I still think he's a bit scurrilous in some situations, but I
Do you kind
think,
of do you agree with like I had Elizabeth Leonard on when she published her Butler biography, and she takes a very positive spin on Butler with sort of the way he's. So did that kind of ring with you as you kind of were?
yeah, I was influenced by her interpretation somewhat, especially later in life. I think
Hmm.
Butler really becomes quite the radical. Um, I think that process was a little bit slower than maybe that might be the only thing that she and I disagree
Hmm.
on because there's a great book, Men is Cheap by
Hmm.
I'm suddenly blanking on it. Brian Lusky, I
Yeah.
think. And
Yeah.
one of his later chapters goes into how Butler wanted to provide uniforms and food
Hmm.
for black troops on a North Carolina coast, but he wanted to be in charge of the money that the government
Hmm.
sent to supply them. And then so there's little bit of nefarious dealings there. And I think that someone who really cares about civil rights and black people and treating them as equals is not going to treat them in such a way. So I'm a bit more conservative in viewing
Hmm.
him as this transformational figure, but for the most part, I think
Hmm.
she's right. Um, what really surprised me is that, I went and got all the biographies of Butler.
Hmm.
There's 4 or 5 of them, and I looked at them because Butler does have these nicknames like Beast Butler or Spoons Butler, and he
Hmm.
has all these terrible stories about him. And I read the biographies and they were all pretty nice.
Hmm.
If not nice, they were at least circumspect. They weren't like these venomous, just terrible criticisms of
Hmm.
Butler. And so I thought, well, first of all, that needs to be noted that there's a divide in the popular memory of Butler and the scholarly understanding of him.
Hmm.
But because of all of the stories about him, typically the biographies of Butler tend to focus on either explaining what he's doing or validating what he's doing and not really connecting it to a larger political or military
Mhm.
narrative that's going on there, which is what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, as I interpret him in that in the second chapter, Butler is one of these hard war figures that's
Hmm.
really got his foot on the pedal a lot sooner than other commanders do. I mean,
Hmm.
he precedes Grant and Sherman and all those with these hard war tactics. Now, he's not
Hmm.
necessarily uh, you know, cutting his supply lines and living off the land and burning it land into the ground. But in terms of policy, he does take a very uh, radical or
Hmm.
hard approach, shall we say. So he passes the woman's order, which is very controversial. He passes General Order number 41, requiring all civic officials or civil officials in the city to take an oath or they get fired. That's pretty striking.
Hmm.
Order number 55 assesses elite Confederates with various levels of taxes, which he then intends to use to feed poor Southerners in the city. So he's deliberately driving a wedge
Yeah.
between the upper class and lower class there. And then in September, he passes order number 76, which, as Jacqueline Campbell writes about in her article, many people thought to be far more controversial than the woman's order because it
Hmm.
requires that women sign a loyalty oath.
Hmm.
He approaches women as legitimate political combatants that need to be handled. And then another one of his controversial orders is Order number 91, which sequestered all Confederate property in the LaForce district. And if you were found to be loyal to the Confederacy, your land would be sold. And if you were loyal to the Union, you could hang on to your land. And in December of 62, Jefferson Davis issues his General Order number 111 or General Statement, I don't know, or whatever it's termed. And of course, he attacks Butler, calls him a war criminal, all these things. But of all the general orders that Butler has issued, the only one that he specifically names is number 91.
Hmm.
He's concerned about the order that attacks property. And he mentions the other things like he's ruined the reputations of women, but he doesn't name any of these other orders. He doesn't
Hmm.
even name the woman's order. He alludes to it, but he specifically names out number 91, which connected to my interpretation of household war because Butler's literally targeting like the physical property of Confederates, and Davis takes note of that. That property is the found and property rights are the foundation of the Confederacy, especially in terms of slavery. And once the Union Army targets that, that's a radical maneuver. Butler is the tip of the blade in
Hmm.
terms of pursuing Confederate property, dismantling slavery, not necessarily treating formerly enslaved people as equals, but at least beginning to think about free labor,
Hmm.
beginning to treat Confederate women as combatants, beginning to treat Confederates not only as, a military enemy, but a
Hmm.
political enemy. They have to be revitalized. They have to sign a loyalty oath.
Hmm.
And I think that there are other generals like General John Pope in Virginia. General Banks does some of this similar things in the Shenandoah Valley, and then Grant begins to do the same thing in Nashville and Memphis. And so I'm not saying that Butler is solely responsible for the Union hard war policy. I'm saying that he's at the forefront, along with a handful of other generals that really begin to change
Hmm.
the character of the war.
Right. Yeah, but as you were talking, one of the things that also I thought about was, and you mentioned it in your books, that while he's doing this hard war policy towards white Southerners,
Hmm,
he is not doing what he did in Fortress Monroe
sure.
with contraband, right? He
Yes.
takes, with regard to African American, a different approach with regard to the occupation.
Yeah, I think that that is literally a consequence of the numbers of enslaved people
Hmm.
that are in Louisiana. He's at Fortress Monroe. He's dealing with a few hundred, a few
Yeah,
thousand. He gets to Louisiana.
it's
There's
tens of
something
thousands.
like 300,000 enslaved people
Ooh.
in Louisiana. Of course, not all of them are very close to his lines, but the majority of them are going to
Hmm.
be in the sugar parishes along the river. Butler has 10, 15,000 guys in the most populated city in the Confederacy. He is very far from any help Like if the Confederates mount a very strong army against him, they're going to
Mhm.
push him right into the sea.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, Butler realizes he can't pursue his contraband policy to the extent that he did at Fort Monroe.
Mhm.
Again, it's easy from our 21st century perspective to point fingers and say, "Oh, he's racist. He's terrible." I tried to be a bit more circumspect and say, Butler has supply issues.
Mhm.
I mean, he could have started recruiting soldiers a lot earlier, black soldiers, I
Mhm.
think, and pursued military strategy a bit more.
Mhm.
But we also have to think that in mid to late 1862, there's not a lot of direction from the Lincoln administration
Right.
yet about what's going to be done with slavery until the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right.
So in the summer of 62, the Lincoln administration is just telling him, do what works best for you. It would be cool if you would, free the slaves and maybe recruit them, but yeah.
Well, you
Um,
also have to consider the context of the time, right? He probably knows what happened to Vermont with regard to the Emancipation Proclamation. He knows what, I forget the general's name in South Carolina who tried to recruit an African American unit.
it's Hunter.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah, Hunter. Yeah. And it's like he knows that if you go too far from what the Lincoln administration is willing to do right now, it could mean you lose your job.
yeah. So I think Butler comes in. He's very hard on white Confederates.
Mm,
He's very conciliatory towards white Unionists, and he is on the fence when it comes to Black Americans. And I have to agree with Elizabeth Leonard in that I think I don't think she says this in her book, but I think taking what she does say about Butler later in his war career in his life, if Butler could have remained in Louisiana, I'm
mm,
fairly confident that he would have really come around to be one of the more radical
mm,
generals in terms of recruiting black soldiers and using them because the Union Army has limited men in
mm,
Louisiana. And that's one reason why Louisiana produces more free black units than any other state. It's because they
mm,
need the manpower. And Andy Lang and other historians talk about this, that recruiting black soldiers is a way to get more
mm.
white soldiers out of occupation into the front lines. And Louisiana is and the Mississippi Valley in its entirety is the most outstanding example of that.
Yeah. I mean, like it's a heavy plantation belt with a lot of possible recruits.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, let's see. Kind of trying to think here because I wrote down civil obedience, civil disobedience was also a big issue that kind of Butler has to tackle, and I mean, what I think is sort of a challenge to consider here is right that you don't have you're an occupation force that comes in, and this is across the state. You are now the police force, right?
Yeah,
The sheriff is not necessarily loyal to you. If there is a police in New Orleans, they're not going to necessarily be loyal to you. So
sure.
you have to deal with people you, you who don't want to be under your rule potentially.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. And my favorite part about researching and writing about that was the very creative ways that Confederate
Yeah.
citizens, especially women, found to oppose
Hmm.
the Union. So they would get off of rail cars rather than sit
Hmm.
next to Union soldiers. They wouldn't sit next to them in church, and they would refuse to read the Emancipation Proclamation. You've got the very famous pictures from Harper's Weekly of Confederate women spitting in the faces
Hmm.
of Union troops, and they would wear like Confederate flag lapels and all these sorts of things.
Hmm.
Um, there are scholars like Alicia Long who have taken this kind of domestic rebellion very seriously, as I think it should. But military scholars don't take this seriously enough, again, because Butler is very isolated in the
Hmm.
deep, deep South and the
Yeah.
Gulf South. And if the Confederates are going to mount some sort of counterattack against New Orleans, and he can't even control the civilian
Hmm.
population, that does represent a legitimate military threat to him. So his efforts to tax elite Confederates more, the woman's order of saying if you spit at my troops, you're going to be treated like a prostitute. You have to take an oath. All of these are way of and confiscating Confederate property.
Yeah.
All of these are ways of trying to quell the Confederate
Mm-hmm.
population. He's using the carrot and the stick at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
If you rebel, you'll be punished. If you stay loyal, you'll be rewarded because I will protect property. It's not going to confiscate it for military use.
I kind of had to chuckle there for a minute because it's like I always love when you probably have it too, right? When you ask your students why study history, it's they're like to not repeat the past.
Yeah.
And it's like when you look at exactly this, right? Of like how do you deal with a precarious situation you're in enemy territory with a potentially hostile civilian population? I mean, that's the same you soldiers faced in Vietnam, soldiers faced in Iraq, soldiers faced in Afghanistan. What the Russian troops face in Ukraine right now, it's all over it. It's the story of the military when you go into another country to kind of take over.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I have a dream of one day writing a history of the United States experience with occupation from the colonial era to Iraq and Afghanistan, because there's a lot of major threads that flow throughout all the wars of these civil military relations. And I even have a picture of my mother's father who was stationed in the islands. I can't remember the name of the islands south of Japan, shortly after the Korean War. And there's a picture of him handing out
like
uh,
Okinawa
candy
Island. Yeah.
to children. Yeah, I think it's either Okinawa or one of the surrounding islands.
Yeah.
So this remains a persistent theme of military
Hmm.
occupation. And the Civil War, especially in Louisiana, is particularly pertinent because by the time the Union Army gets there, the blockade has had a tremendous effect
Hmm.
on them.
Yeah.
And as some Union soldiers note, the city is on the brink of starvation.
Hmm.
So when Butler starts, opening up the military supply bases to the people, I have a great picture of that in the book. It doesn't matter whether they're loyal to the Confederacy or not. This is about survival.
They want food.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is one of the issues that is really difficult to study in wartime, including the Civil War, is how much does survival trump nationalism?
Hmm.
How much does local family loyalty and just bare necessities triumph over some sort of ideological allegiance to the cause? And it's really hard to come up with any concrete answers about that because it's not like people are sitting down and writing in their diary. Today I'm loyal and I spat at the Yankees, and then the next day, or today I was hungry, so I decided to tone down my hatred a little bit. It's very hard to come to some sort of uh, objective answer about that, and I think military scholars need to grapple with that
Hmm.
more. That war is much more than the study of the battles, which are
Hmm.
fascinating. I'm not denigrating them. It's just that for the majority of people, their wartime experience
Hmm.
is the home front experience. Because most people are not in the army. And even when you're in the army, you're not fighting all the time. You're sitting in camp or digging trenches or doing all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So
That's
the social experience of war is more
that's
prevalent.
exactly what I told my students when I taught that. The one time I taught the American Civil War as a college professor, I was like, look, when you think of the military, there's 365 days, and in the best case, we're talking 10 to 15 days of those that they actually engage in a battle.
Yeah.
The vast majorities, they didn't fight.
Yeah. And so military history, like it or not, is often just the boring, routine, everyday life within the army. And I don't necessarily think it's boring because I think looking at
Hmm.
the patterns of governance and the patterns of
Hmm.
power that develop from
Hmm.
those non-battle military moments tell us something about the nation itself.
Hmm.
And I think what emerges from the Civil War is this conservative revolution, but mostly a nation that said we defeated the traitors, the enemy,
Hmm.
and that's as far as we're going to go. And I think occupation is a good demonstration of that as well.
Right. Yeah.
Got some people that are working with Black people, like Thomas Conway, who really I think has a change of heart and looks at them as equals. He's superintendent of labor
Hmm.
under Banks and doing everything that he can to make life better for them. And there are other people, the other commanders that just don't care and do not treat black people equitably, do not distribute land and resources to them. And oftentimes, as some of the people that I quoted in my book, the laborers are complaining they're not even getting the rations or the money that they're owed from their contracts. And so occupation is illustrative in that way that there are plenty of white Union people, whether they be Southern or Northern, that are not willing to carry occupation beyond just the basic military defeat of the enemy.
Uh, so yeah, there's like two different directions that we could go with this, but
Sure.
I kind of want to go back to, or kind of go stick with like the precarious situation that the U.S. forces are in,
Yeah.
because what I've found really interesting too in your book was when the U.S. military is pushing inland, like right, we're going towards like down in the south, sort of up towards the I guess that's the Atchafalaya River area, like Thibodeau, Homa, or like from Bat into Baton Rouge. There is of course the initial push, but most of the work is really done by like a small force of provost marshals
Yeah.
in that occupation. So in part, I kind of would like you to maybe elaborate a little bit. What do I have to imagine when you tell me that the provost marshal is doing work here? Who are these guys? Where do they come
Sure.
from? And like, what does it mean when you have just this small force then that does and is in charge of occupation?
Yeah, I think I want to start by answering that question with just giving a basic narrative of how the war goes in
Sure.
Louisiana, just for anyone watching or listening that needs a broader understanding of that. The Union Army arrives in April, May of
Mhm.
62. They take over New Orleans. They push to Baton Rouge pretty quickly. And other than the Lafourche offensive in the fall of 62, which is immediately to the west of New Orleans, Butler doesn't oversee very many military offensives. As I argue, he's much more concerned with social order, household order, domestic order, whatever you want to call it. Then he's replaced by Banks in December of 1862. Banks has a lot of ambition, both military and presidential. He's hopeful that maybe he can gain the party's nomination in 64. The Union forces do retreat from Baton Rouge, I think, in August, and they surrender it back to the Confederates for a brief moment in time. Banks retakes that. He spends most of the summer of 63 taking Port Hudson,
Mhm.
which falls on July 9th of 63. I think he makes it as far north as Alexandria that summer. And of course, the next year, in the spring of 64, is his disastrous Red River campaign. So the Union military extent is pretty limited to the southern and to some extent the central portions of Louisiana. So you have a lot of troops on the front lines, so to speak, at Port Hudson, at Vicksburg, at Baton Rouge, at Berwick Bay, these places. But behind the lines, you have what today we would call military police,
Mhm.
provost marshals. And I tried to give a little bit of a history of them in the book. It's a concept that goes back several centuries of having provost marshals or military police, and it goes back to English history that I'm not exactly an expert in, but it's a concept where you take military figures, sometimes officers, sometimes just common enlisted or non-commissioned officers, and giving them permission to guard roads, guard supply depots, ensure that people have taken oaths, confiscate weapons. The list goes on and on and on. My favorite character, for lack of a better word, that I came across during that time, and sorry, I don't have like an image I can share on my screen right away, but he's in the book. He's That's Albert Stearns. He is a police officer from New York State, and it makes sense that Union officials would look around and say, "Who already has experience
Mhm.
with population control, or I guess I should say crowd control,
Mhm.
and maintaining law and order. And they just sort of get asked nicely if they, or not so nicely sometimes, if they want to be in the ranks of the provost marshals. Albert Stearns refers to the provost marshal as a machine. They're
Mhm.
the people that keep the machine of occupation going. They've got to make sure that the prisoners are being well treated. They've got to make sure that the emancipated people have contracts, labor contracts, and that those contracts are being respected. They have to patrol the city both day and night. Sometimes they deputize local police officers if they're loyal
Mhm.
into this force, and other times police force or various members of it are dismissed and replaced either with loyal citizens or with soldiers. So they are these really important figures that haven't been written about
Mhm.
very much within the historiography that, as Stearns says, are part of this machine that keeps the
Mhm.
Union Army and the Confederate Army as well going and maintaining the supply lines and the lines of information and internal discipline while the Army is off fighting and doing all its other things. So they're really important.
Mhm. Yeah, and no one has talked about some.
Yeah.
Like, I don't.
I hope to write
Is
more
there a
about them in
book
the
on
future.
it?
There is a book that I found after I had published this book called Rebel Watchdog. I think it came out in the 80s. I can't remember the
Oh,
author's name, but it's a book about the Confederate Provost Marshal. And it was one of those situations where I just wanted to pull my hair out because I found this book and I was like, I wish I could have read this and cited it for this book. But those sort of things happen,
yeah, of
especially with
course.
older books that have kind of disappeared out of view. It's hard to uncover them all. But I don't think beyond that there's any book length work on provost marshals.
Hmm.
So, as I said earlier, I want to write more about occupation, and they're definitely going to be one of the main
Mhm.
figures in there
Yeah.
because they're the guys that make things tick.
Yeah. But for any grad student listening, that would be a great dissertation topic
Yeah,
or
it
a
would.
first book project
The
or
records are voluminous. There really are. The Provost Marshal records in DC, there are thousands of them. For the state of Missouri, the Provost Marshal records are actually keyword searchable on a website. I can't remember the name of it. I think I can look it up really quick. Um,
uh,
the two or more civilians, Missouri Digital Heritage. Yeah, just Google that or something, and you can actually search through the Provost Marshal records from that state.
insane. Incredible. Incredible that
Yeah,
that's all possible now. Yeah. Um, but then it is like it as you said, it's a very small group of people that are having to do the sort of maintenance of US authority, which is extremely challenging
yeah,
in a because I assume that it's not just that they have to kind of maintain order, but they also have to that includes labor relations on plantations.
absolutely. Labor relations and local relations. This was, I think, another strong component of using household war as a category of
Mhm.
analysis because they have to walk into people's houses and you didn't take the oath. Okay, you have to be registered as an enemy. How much furniture do you have? How much property do you have? I found all sorts of records like this in the National Archives, were just lists of people's property because they refused to sign an oath. So the Union Army categorizes the things that they have, and whether they got to keep it or not, depended on how sticky the hands of the provost marshal were, or other Union soldiers. There's another excellent example I use in the book of an enslaved child or formerly enslaved child who's been taken by a Union officer back to her former master, Miss Tiffin, as she appears in the record. And the child's mother writes to the provost marshal, I, a Union officer has taken my child. I want it back. And this letter makes its way up to uh, Conway, and then it makes its way up to General Bowen, and I think they send it up to Banks. I can't remember, but they have to go back into Mrs. Tiffin's
Mhm.
house and grab the child and bring her back. So this is literally like face-to-face
Mhm.
rhetorical combat, so to speak, that they have to do with civilians all the time to maintain law and order.
Yeah, that's again when you think of like military history, right? That's military historians think of like, oh, enemy versus enemy, but for a lot of these soldiers, it wasn't enemy versus enemy on the battlefield. It was them dealing with all kinds of personal civilian issues.
Yeah. Which I find fascinating.
Yeah.
Just the personalities involved and the kind of situations that the troops would get involved in. One of the more funny records I found was when a member of General Banks' staff was walking home late one night or to his barracks or wherever, and he was arrested by an overeager night watchman. And I found this very sternly written or sternly worded letter the next day of like, if you ever arrest one of my officers again, you will be in a world of hurt. So uh, yeah, studying the provost marshal records gives you such insight not only into the operations of the military, but into the daily
Mhm.
lives of Southerners and Black people as well, who are also Southerners, but they have a different
Mhm.
concept or relationship to the military than the white people, and it's just so fascinating.
Yeah. I, going back to you when you did your brief history there, you kind of mentioned already two of the commanders for the region here, or the Department of the Gulf.
Yes.
We got Butler, we got Banks, we got Canby eventually. So I kind of you you seem to be liking Butler over Banks. I kind of got the feeling.
Yeah. You're supposed to remain objective, I know, and not like any of your historical matter or characters any more than the other. Um, I came to appreciate, like is maybe a strong term, of Butler's approach because I felt that it would have been necessary to carry on that approach to actually win the Civil War in more than just a military way, to win it in a cultural way as well, to
Hmm.
never let the lost cause kind of gain primacy in
Hmm.
the era of Reconstruction. Banks, I did not like as much because I found him to be far more conciliatory
Hmm.
to Southerners, both those that remained loyal to the Confederates and to Unionists, far more concerned with his military reputation
Hmm.
and with the kinds of policies that Butler was interested in. I still think that he has to maintain law and order and
Hmm.
issue policies that affect the everyday household lives of Southerners, but not to the extent that Butler did. Canby is different from both of them because Edward Canby, first of all, he's only in charge for a few months in 1865. Second of all, he's an actual military officer. Like he had experience in the Mexican-American War. Butler and Banks are both political generals.
Hmm.
They both knew it. And Butler makes his name amongst the radical Republicans because of his approach at Fort Monroe, because of his aggressive approach with, say, the Woman's Order and property sequestration in Louisiana. Banks makes a name for himself among the more moderate or conservative Republicans because he's one of these folks that thinks that he can do a better job than Lincoln. And he intends to prove that on the battlefield, doesn't work out too well. Can be, and I didn't spend too much time on him in the book. I think is more of your nuts and bolts
Hmm.
military guy who's just concerned with here's where the front line is. By 1865, the Union force is pretty threadbare in Louisiana. He's just looking to hold operations down. He's not interested in experimenting with free labor like Butler and Banks, just in making the machine work, and
Hmm.
then he goes home.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think that's the major distinctions between those three guys.
Right. Well, with Banks, you also have that issue that he's much less accommodating, I guess would be the word choice, towards free people that now are trying to figure out where's their place in the new society.
Yeah. Butler, he begins to set up a free labor policy late in his administration, like October,
Hmm.
early November, somewhere in there. There's not enough time for it to really get off the ground. If I recall correctly, he is offering more money to them in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what they're guaranteed by their contracts, whereas banks offers them less money and also uh, the money that it costs the employer to clothe and feed them gets taken out of that payment as well. So Banks really tries to make a name for himself with his free labor policy, and he touts that, especially when he goes to DC to visit with the Lincoln administration and um, later in the war, 64, 65, somewhere in there. But from my perspective, as some of the people on the ground themselves said, Banks's labor program is little removed from slavery itself.
Mm-hmm.
Enslaved people are still living in enslaved cabins. Their corporal punishment is supposedly banned, though there are some instances in
Mm-hmm.
which that continues to occur. There are instances of workers never getting their money, never getting their
Mm-hmm.
clothing or their rations issued to them. So I see Banks' labor policy as a good start, but it's more of a program that he intends to make himself look good and to keep all these laborers occupied while he is, concerned with other activities.
Yeah.
Some of my favorite sources are when the formerly enslaved people just start dragging furniture and things out of Confederate homes, or if the master runs away and abandons the property, which is another aspect of the household war to me, because the enslaved people are literally entering the white household, taking their property and things and putting it in their cabins and saying, this is our land, we've worked here, we've toiled here. And so I think at some point in the book, I say this, or I certainly say it when I'm giving lectures or speaking engagements. The Confederate and Union military commanders, they look at Louisiana as a military problem.
Mm-hmm.
The enslaved people, the emancipated people, look at Louisiana as a family problem. How can I
Mm-hmm.
get back to my relatives? How can I sustain my family networks? How can I get a job for myself? How am I gonna fill my house with furniture?
Mm-hmm.
I love the provost marshal record I found of an emancipated person who dragged a bedstead all the way out of the plantation house to his cabin. Uh, Their homes are important to them. They're not necessarily concerned with the grand strategy of the war.
Yeah. Well, it's since you're going to bring it back to the family and sort of household war, it's also an issue then that if you are a man getting recruited into the US military and you're getting like maybe your family lives in like just south of Baton Rouge and then you get sent to like Port Hudson or like Homa and you're far away from your family, so you can't protect
Absolutely.
them anymore. So all of a sudden that military role of yours impacts your family role.
Absolutely. Yeah, some of the Union observers or newspaper reporters, they come to Louisiana, they look out in the fields, and they see mostly women and children there. I have a picture of a Baton Rouge contraband camp in the book, and it's one I show to my students, and I ask them, how many men do you see in this picture?
Mhm.
They can spot a few in the back, and those men are wearing, the infantry kepis. They
Mhm.
are soldiers, but it's mostly women and children. So in terms of understanding emancipation as a gendered process that affects the
Mhm.
black family, so often the men are put onto work details or
Mhm.
pushed into the army, and the women are in the fields. I have a picture of a contract from the National Archives. It's not the best picture, it's not very clear, but I put it in the book specifically because a lot of the contracts that were issued to the employers and landowners by the Union Army that they wanted them to fill out along with the signatures of the workers would say, I have hereby this day employed the following men
Mhm.
into the army. And the picture I included has a little, arrow or shoehorn, whatever you want to call it. And the phrase and women is written into the
Mm.
contract
Yeah.
because most of the contracts that I came across were signed by women.
Mm.
There were many more female signatures
Wow.
on names on these contracts than men.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. No. Somebody did forget something there when they made those form contracts.
Yeah. Again, because they're assuming
Yeah.
that from the white perspective, the free
Hmm.
labor perspective is
Yeah.
that the man goes out and labors and produces income for the household, and the women stay at home in the
Hmm.
traditional like Harriet
Yeah.
Beecher Stowe middle class perspective
Right.
of the way the household works. The women are at home taking care of the children, and not that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but that just wasn't the reality for Black families, especially in a war where oftentimes one side or the other would burn all the nearest crops they could
Mm.
find when the enemy was approaching because they don't want that to fall into
Right.
enemy hands. That has a tremendous effect
Mm.
on the family stability of Black people.
Yeah. Well, in many ways, then also sort of that an illustration of sort of the lack of imagination on the part of the U.S. forces in the area, that they can't think about like how will this be different? How will this conflict change the social and labor environments in this
Absolutely.
area?
Yeah, I think the phrase lack of imagination is perfect to describe what's going on with occupation.
You may
Uh,
use it in your next book.
I think Butler has a little imagination. You have to be imaginative to come up with the woman's order, but uh, beyond that, the Union commanders are not too imaginative. They're very traditional in that, especially Banks. I'm going to go out with military offensives,
Hmm.
and I'm going to set up a labor bureau back here and just let the military run it or loyal subjects run it. And at no point does he want to redistribute property and allow Black people to work it and live on it as autonomous, equal
Hmm.
citizens.
Yeah, there's your major failure right there.
Yeah.
But since you brought Banks briefly back into the conversation, I did want to talk about the 1864 election, which he did. Well, I'm not sure how much he manipulated the vote in favor of Lincoln there, but it seemed like it was quite dubious.
Sure. It's difficult to get a grasp on that election as well. I don't know if they were necessarily like forcing people to go to the polls. This is February of
Mhm.
1864, but there's some announcement of it weeks ahead of time, and I did find some orders from various commanders, Banks included, to their lower commanders get the word out as far as you can and do as
Mhm.
much as possible to get loyal citizens, of course, by which they mean white men, to the polls and protect the polls as best as you can.
Mhm.
And I also found records of the military using military transport to, transport people to the nearest polling place, et cetera. So Banks does a really good job of facilitating the election. I have no idea the extent to which he manipulated the vote in the process because
Mhm.
Michael Hahn wins pretty handily
Mhm.
that election. I don't know if commanders were instructing voters as they're, headed to the polling place. You know who to vote for. I didn't find any evidence of that. But this is an important example of how the military could possibly restructure the the political democracy,
Mhm.
the everyday workings of, campaigns and voting of the United States, and it still looks so traditional. It's mostly white men. It has to be loyal white men, those that have signed an oath. So that's a distinction from before. But the new state government comes in and they start, they have to pass some sort of abolition law, abolition of slavery, according to Lincoln's Amnesty Proclamation. They do provide some education or money for education in New Orleans, but they don't pass black male suffrage. And I think that's very telling. The
Mhm.
military has come in, it has facilitated to some extent the restoration of the republic, and that republic looks very similar to the antebellum nation. I think Lincoln was really disappointed because he was hoping that the better angels of our natures would prevail once the storm of war had passed, and we would experience, as he called it, a new birth of freedom. And when you look at state elections and the violence that occurred, even as the war is dying down, that new birth of freedom just did not occur in many places.
I mean, it's the hypothetical, right? Of like, how would this have ended with if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated, right? If like the guys like Butler would have been more in charge of Reconstruction, or the radicals had been able to kind of maintain their power more during Reconstruction, or like the Depression of 1873 hadn't happened. So like,
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of what ifs that,
Sure.
and I mean, yeah, I don't know. It would be interesting if we could kind of make a scientific experiment and kind of put the ingredients all in and kind of see where, if we leave one out, how the outcome would be.
Maybe AI can do it. Maybe ChatGPT can figure it
Oh.
out. Uh,
Yeah, no, I don't want to even go there, considering how
sure.
obsessed my students are with that stuff.
Yeah, it's a disappointment.
But I'm sure ChatGPT would have an answer for it.
Yeah, there's got to be some sort of computer model of what might have happened if Lincoln had lived,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
more radical commanders like Butler had
right.
come to the fore. I mean, a good way to think about this is there's a great book that I'm blanking on the title of now, but anyway, the example I'm thinking of is that when Sherman uh, was taking the surrender of Johnson in North
Mhm.
Carolina, he was willing to just make peace with the whole Confederacy. And
Yes,
uh,
overstepping slightly.
yeah, it's Greg Downs, After Appomattox. That's the name
Mhm.
of the book I'm thinking of. There are just too many commanders like Sherman that see their role in the war as purely military, and they're not interested, as we've said several times already today, they're not interested in any grander social experiments with reconstructing uh, the nation in a way that might be a bit more inclusive.
Mhm.
And that's why I think that the nation that emerges from the Civil War is not truly democratic in the sense that it does not include everyone's voice. And that's maybe a basic concept to say, but if a democracy is only as old as its youngest constituency, my point was that the unlike people like Foner and others who look at the Civil War as this major changing point, I'm more circumspect. I'm more suspicious of the what the war actually achieved. The end of
Mhm.
slavery is excellent, and that was only the first step in the road towards equality and inclusion that
Mhm.
as I tell my students, after 1865, it was another 100 years before we got the 1965 Voting Rights Act.
Mhm.
So there was much work to be done. I think military occupation could have played a key role in that,
Yeah,
and it did.
yeah. The will for change was very low, which
Yeah,
I mean, when you're in the broader scheme of things, sing, and I just had a conversation. My history class was a student that where we looked at French history. Like it's this is not quite yet the period of social revolution. We're very circumspect of that. We don't want major changes, and that's probably part of human nature that we just don't. We want the thing that's familiar over the thing that is new and different. Um,
yeah, absolutely.
um, as we draw to the close here, because we're going for about an hour and 20 minutes now,
Yeah,
um, I want to briefly one more time change back to the other side,
yeah,
because I kind of feel like we talked about the Union side, U.S. side, so much that like they're advancing into the states. There's sort of this gray area on the frontier here where the authorities sort of overlap and no authority exists. But substantial parts of the state are under occupation.
yeah.
Substantial parts of Louisiana's population are living under U.S. authority. And it sort of reminded me of Upon an Altar of a Nation.
Mhm.
Because in that book, the author argues that one of the failures of the Confederacy was that it couldn't psychologically anymore show that it was able to defend its people, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's what Sherman goes after in the march through Georgia and through the Carolinas to showcase psychologically that you your government is unable to protect you. And it feels like in Louisiana, you have a very similar situation that with so much territory under occupation, so many people under occupation, that Confederate authorities being rather brutal with some of their impressment policies.
Yeah,
How much loyalty do you lose when you can't protect your people?
absolutely. That's why I think that the governor that comes in after Governor Moore, Henry Watkins Allen, who had been a Confederate general, in fact, was sworn in on crutches because he had experienced a wound at the Battle of Baton Rouge, I believe. Probably next to Joseph Brown of Georgia, one of the best Confederate governors, because he realizes very quickly that the war he's facing in Louisiana is unique in that it's
Mhm.
not just a military front line, but he has to shore up the material safety of the people and also do his best to restore their faith in the government. He does this in a number of ways. First of all, he uh, gathers up as many deserters as he can find and gets them back into the ranks. And that's a way of making the military situation stronger and making Confederates feel more secure. He builds a lot of defenses in the northern part of Louisiana. This makes citizens feel more safe. He also just had a great relationship to the civilian population, which I think was key to Louisiana remaining in the war as long as it did. He sets up a state store, which looks, somewhat socialist in its aspect. He's taking government resources and creating a store with capped prices where
Mhm.
civilians can come in and access material, and he's trading cotton with Mexico and Texas to get various supplies in there. He sets up a state medical research institute. He does what he can to curb guerrilla activity and reprisals that are going on throughout the state. But at the same time, that doesn't make everybody happy. For instance, in the wake of the Red River campaign,
Mhm.
he puts out a flyer, a notice. There's an actual copy of it at LSU that says, I need as many enslaved workers as possible to set up, to repair the damage that the Union has done, but also to set up new defenses for when they come this way again. And any planter that doesn't is disloyal or he's not doing
Mhm.
his duty to help honor the cause. So I think that Allen does his best a job as possible for a Confederate authority figure to fight a war and sustain the population at the same time. But there's still this friction, especially over property uh, ownership. Like, does the Confederate government have the right to conscript Confederate civilians? Does it have the right to confiscate enslaved labor and use that labor building roads and defenses? And by the end of the war, there's this wonderful attack from Confederate women on a Confederate supply depot at Natchitoches, where they surround the depot and take it over and just dare the Confederate army to challenge them. Of course, that's like March of 1865. So I think throughout the end of 63 and into 64, Allen does as good a job as possible at maintaining the war
Mhm.
effort. But those incidents towards the end of the war, like that Natchitoches takeover, really demonstrate that there is a limit to loyalty. And that
Mhm.
limit often has to do with hunger, I think. I'm not greatly convinced that the Confederates uh, are disloyal to the Confederacy, even if they take a loyalty oath under Union occupation. I do think that, and I think Reconstruction demonstrates this, Southerners remain very dedicated to their cause even after they've been defeated. But the reason it looks like they're losing hope or losing confidence has to do with the lack of material supply.
Mhm. Gotta eat.
Yeah.
That's
And I can't blame them. And that's why
no.
I think a lot of the Confederate politicians and commanders, like Benjamin Palmer, they get all up in arms about this. You can't be a good Confederate if you're of trading with the enemy and all this. It's like it's easy for someone who's relatively well off to say that, but for a working class or middle class Southerner that has lost a lot in the war and they're doing what they can to survive,
Mhm.
That does not mean that they like the Union. It doesn't mean that they want to live under a Lincoln presidency or rejoin the Union. It just means they're trying to survive. And that makes the any war particularly hard to study.
Right. Yeah. And I mean,
Yeah.
in many ways, it's also why you don't have a free state of Jones or a free state of Winston in Louisiana. Right? That they're not unionists. They're just trying to get by in the best way possible.
Yeah.
So, um, but yeah, this is a very interesting study. So I hope and you already said in the conversation before the interview and why we had to kind of delay our scheduled interview a little bit. You had already a chance to talk to a lot of people about your book, so I hope
Yeah.
more people get that opportunity and or people will read it. And if you're interested in the book, Garden of Ruins, Occupied Louisiana in the Civil War by LSU Press.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Matthew, for taking some time today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.